As it turns out, I don't have to scream, which is definitely nice. So hope you had a nice pause, you got some refreshment, got some coffee or whatever you like, and are ready for some more cool Angular content. So and today we are going to speak about the Angular template context mental model, or how I like to put it, like the most important thing you need to understand about the Angular, because it's really in the root of the whole Angular. But first, a very quick introduction. Tomas Trajan, Google developer expert for Angular and web technologies. I build, teach, write, and speak about the Angular, working with Swiss and global enterprises, speaking at the lovely conferences like yours, very happy to be here, and doing Angular, RxJS, and ngRx workshops. Besides that, you maybe know me from my old Angular blog at Medium, which actually yesterday crossed 4 million views, which was very nice. And if you are by any chance, thank you. It was really yesterday when I opened it for that widget here. So if you are writing on Medium by yourself and you would like to have this total overview, you can check the Medium Enhanced Stats Chrome extension which I wrote, which gives you this cool overview of your total views, which you can then share on social media. So that can be something useful for you if you are creating content yourself. And before we jump into the topic, I have to ask you, so who here already uses Angular standalone APIs like components, pipes, and directives in their project now, today? Okay. So some people already, that's cool, and for the others we will build, create a mental model around it, and for those who already use it, hopefully you can learn something more. So as we knew, like now there are new exciting times for the Angular in the community, a lot of stuff is going on, and basically it's mostly caused by finishing the migration from the ViewEngine to Ivy, behind the scenes, the rendering engine, and this unlocks a new Angular evolution and allows the Angular team to focus on delivering many great new features, right? So one of those bigger initiatives is to make NgModules optional, right? So we know that like basically whenever we write Angular application, we have to write NgModules, and this now becomes optional with the introduction of the standalone APIs and especially standalone components. So, but what about the NgModules? Like most of our applications which are today in production, they have many of the modules, right? Like lazy loaded features and all kind of stuff like that. So did our applications just became like a legacy code from one day to another? Like that would be really sad, right? So as it turns out, from the talk of the Pavel Kozlovsky, the Angular core team member on the last ngConf, removing of ngModules from Angular is luckily not a goal for Angular team, so we can like, that's good, right? So our applications did not become a legacy code from one day to another. So, but like what about the ngModules, right? So Angular continues to support the ngModules, and ngModules and standalone components we will see that they can mix and match with ease in our application code bases, and both ngModules and standalone components basically are there to solve exactly the same problem from the point of view of the Angular framework, which we are going to learn today. And because of that, they share this common underlying reality. So, but like, what is this common underlying reality? Well, to learn about that, we have to embark on a journey. And the first stop on that journey is that we have to learn what is a mental model. So basically, it's our mental model in our mind, how something works. So like one of my favorite examples for that is how the door works, right? So if I stand in front of the door and I see the door handle and I push the handle and I push the door and I walk in, right? But imagine like some alien came from other planet and stood in front of the door. Maybe they would not know how to operate such a mechanism, right? So we have many of those mental models. We use them all the time in the everyday life. And now if we want to relate it more to the world of the software engineering, then whoever ever wrote some kind of code, of course, use some kind of variable, right? So we all know what the variable is, that we can store some kind of value. And now we can build on top of that, like if we work with like the JavaScript or TypeScript, then we know that the variable can be let or const, for example, and then we build on top of that, we would know that in the let we can reassign, and in the const we cannot reassign. And if our mental model was even more precise, then we could say that const text does not allow us to reassign, but if it's a complex object and not just the primitive value, then we could still mutate the properties. So as we can see, there are multiple levels to those mental models, and the more precise our mental model is, the better decisions and results we can produce, right? So another very important thing to discuss is a concept of the limited mental model, and a great example for that is like when we use something like a TypeScript, it would be possible to create and deliver a TypeScript application without actually typing anything, right? We could just like set it as a compiler flag that everything is implicit any, or we can just type every single variable as a any. And that application would compile, it would work, it would deliver value to the users, but it would be very suboptimal because if we wanted to extend it and refactor in the future, we would have a lot of pain. So it's really not good to have a limited mental models. And then we can say that the limited template context mental model often leads to Angular applications which are hard to extend and maintain if we do not have a very precise model of how to do that properly. So next step on our journey is to start very basic and speak about the Angular templates. So in the Angular templates, they allow us to write declarative UI, so we can define what should be displayed, how it should change if the data changes, how we should handle the user interaction, and this is of course much better compared to what we have to do before in the world, before the Angular and other frameworks and libraries, in the imperative world where we had to get the reference to like some DOM node and then just reassign like some HTML, which was very insecure and very imperative and hard to maintain, right? So, but here the very important point is that in Angular, in the component template, we can use all the other HTML elements and all the other HTML events out of the box. We do not need to provide any kind of setup for that. So if we have something more realistic like this, so what do we see here? Like we have some other Angular components, so for example material card or material icon, some other Angular directives like ngIf or material button from the Angular material component library, or even stuff like a date pipe, which you can almost see here on that slide. So it's almost there. So those are a bit different, right? So this is not provided by the browser, by the HTML out of the box, right? So, and they have something in common, so that all the template-related entities in Angular, such as component pipes and directives, are known as declarables, and there is a reason for that, because there is something special about them. So what is the special thing? If we came back to that example which we had previously, and simplified it just to focus on what matters, so the wrapping element was the material card. So if we had such a code in our application and we just run the ngserve, actually what would happen is we will get an error where the compiler will complain that material card is not a known element and is not part of this module, right? Or if we use standalone components, it would complain that is not part of the components imports. So, and of course, we would get the same errors for pipes and directives. So what this means is that if we want to use an Angular declarable, so the component pipe or a directive, in the template of another Angular component, we have to provide some kind of setup. So they require setup. And this is why it's very important to build that strong Angular template context mental model, which will allow us to provide that setup in the best possible way. So let's start with like the most basic example. We have a one component, application component, and in the template of that component, we want to render another component. Great. So that's a declarable. We know we need some setup. So if we just generate that by the schematics, like a new application, we would get an application module in the world before the standalone components, and we would put that application, or the application component would be in the list of the declarations and also in the bootstrap, right? And again, if we would run this application, we would get the same error that the my organization hello component is not part of this module. And as you can see, I really like to work with the enterprises because I always prefix everything with like my organization, like big ink and stuff like that. So, okay, this doesn't work. So my organization hello component is not part of the same Angular template context. So how can we fix that? So like the most naive approach would be, of course, to add this hello component in the list of the declarations of the same module. And this this would lead to a situation where we have a single big template context, which is managed by the application module, and then because of that, application module tries to use this hello organization component in its template, and it can because they are both part of the same template context. So this is very simple, very easy, it just works. But in practice, we usually don't have just one module in our application because it would lead to many undesirable consequences, like a huge bundle size, which is bad for the users because the application takes a long time to load through the network, long time to start up on slow devices. Also from our perspective as a developers, whenever we would make a change to that code, the rebuild times or retest times would be very slow. So we of course do not want that. And therefore in practice we often have applications which have more than one ngModule, right? So and the most typical other modules are if we have a lazy loaded features, or we have modules from the other third-party component libraries like Angular Material or Taiga UI or Prime Faces or Prime NG, right? Or maybe we have something like a shared module for the shared components and widgets which are local to our repository, to our application workspace. So, but those are like realistic examples, but to keep it simple for the purposes of learning this concept, we just create some random hello module, and now we want to extract that hello component, so we remove it from the declarations of the application module and put it to the declaration of the hello module. So now the situation changes, we don't have just one template context, we have two template contexts, and they are not connected in any way, of course. So therefore, if we try to run this application, this is not going to work, and we would get the same error because there is no connection, so we cannot use this hello component, the template of the app component. So how can we try to fix it is by connecting those two template contexts, by adding the hello module import in the application module import, right? So that's like the most logical thing, and this should work, right? So who thinks this is going to work already? Some people. So no, it's not gonna work, because even though we connected those two template contexts, the hello component is basically private, because even though it was declared, it was not exported. So even though we are creating this one bigger connected template context, the hello component is basically private, and therefore we cannot get it. So to fix that, what we can do is to, of course, add it to the exports. And then the situation changes. Now we have this one bigger connected template context of both the app module and the hello module. And here I try to show it with this line that if we try to get in a template, we go through this reference to the exports, and we can finally get hold of that hello component. And of course, it has to be declared in some module, and that's the hello module. So far, so good. The application compiles without the error. We can start writing some other logic. So basically, here the takeaway is the component which belongs to Angular template context is private to that context as long as we did not add it to the exports array. Now, what about the built-in Angular module? This represents another stepping stone. So we are used to working with stuff like common module and router module and many others, and they work exactly the same as our own custom ngModules which we are writing for the features or for the shared. And they, like for example, those two especially deliver stuff like ngIf, ng4, router link directives, or router outlet component. And we can also then add them exactly the same way, make them part of our own template context to be able to use those things like ngIf, ng4, which they deliver, right? So the mechanism is exactly the same. So if we then look at the implementation of the common module in the Angular repository on the GitHub, we would see that it declares this ngIf directive, and of course that would be useless, so it also has to export it. And if you actually took time and really look into that repository, you would find it slightly different. There are like two arrays to like basically prevent the code duplication, but behind the scenes this is exactly what's going on. So now let's build on top of our example. We have app component, and now we want to use ngIf. We didn't provide the setup yet, so what should we import? Of course, the common module, right? But what would happen if we imported browser module instead? Will this work? So who thinks this is going to work? Okay, so not many people who think this is not going to work. Even less people, interesting. So most will abstain, that's fine. So this represents a really great example that Angular came out already like in 2014, right? So this is like a very core API and people still are not completely clear on this. So, and it also represents a great intro for the next subtopic, which is the transitive template context. So what is going on in the previous example? We have a common module and we know it declares and exports the ngIf. And then we have a browser module, and as it turns out, if you looked into GitHub, the browser module actually re-exports the common module, right? So that what it means is that if we import that browser module in an app module, we are basically going through two levels. So this is added to the template context, and then this is added to the template context, and it exports the ngIf, which is declared here, right? So we have more than one level. So we are creating a bigger template context. So now if we wanted to put all these things together to create like a really big context, which often happens in application, and I understand like there are many ways to do like shared modules in a bad way, so we are not going to speak about that. There are also good ways, but let's just for the sake of the example, so if we want to put all these concepts which you just learned together in the example of the shared module, we can start by imports. So what we want to bring inside of our template context. So for example, the common module, which brings ngIf, ngFor and other stuff, and a material card module, which brings material card component. So now they're available in the context. So if we start to implementing some local shared widgets like my organization rating component or my organization animated star component, they will be able to use those ngIf, ngFor and material card in their own templates, right? Because it's part of the same template context. But now, such a shared module would be useless because everything is private. So what we have to do is to add some exports. And this is what is going to be delivered to the consumer of that shared module in that target template context. And here we say we export the common, so that way if we use it in a lazy loaded feature, we don't have to import the shared and common, but just the shared, because we are exporting the common. And then probably the card will be useful in most of our features, so also the card and organization rating, but not the animated star, that stays private. And maybe we just re-export the toolbar, which can be used then in the consumers, but not in the local context. So this example illustrates like all those mechanics which happens when we use ngModules with regards to like building of a local template context, adding stuff transitively and exporting things, right? So the summary of that is that the template context based with the ngModules can be transitive. The target template context can receive declarables from the first level, so that's like if the shared module exports this local my organization rating widget, or from the second till nth levels, as deep as we want to go, but hopefully we don't go too deep. So that's as if shared module re-exports the material card module, which re-exports material card component. And as you can see, this can get complicated pretty quickly, and that's why we will see later the standalone components can simplify this whole thing quite a lot. Great. So now we really did like a very quick recap on the ngModules and how they handle the template context, and now we will be on our way towards the standalone Angular. And the first stop on that way is to discuss a little bit the SCAM pattern, which is not really most luckiest name, but it basically stands for the single component Angular module, which was very popular just before the introduction of the standalone components. So basically what it does is that there is one component and one module, and this module always just declares and exports that component and nothing else. So this is how it would look like. This hello module, which we have previously, would basically fulfill the criteria to be called like a SCAM pattern. So the Angular SCAM pattern is a great stepping stone for building of the Angular standalone components template context mental model, because it basically represents like an intermediary step on that way. So let's compare them side by side or like next to each other. So if we have a SCAM, we have a component. There is a corresponding module. That module has to declare and export that component and only that component. And plus, of course, it defines the local template context for that component, so what this component can use in its template. Now, with the standalone components, the situation is very similar, but slightly different. We do not have a module anymore. We just declare component as a standalone. And then, of course, again, we have to define the imports to bring everything into that context to be able to use it in the template. But we do not have to specify the declarations or exports, which is great because that way we cannot make a mistake. We cannot add multiple things in export. We cannot add multiple things in declarations. It's guaranteed to be that it's just this hello component, which is great. And now finally we can arrive at our destination, which is the Angular standalone components template context. So again, if we go to our most base example, we have one component. We mark it as a standalone. We do not need a module anymore. And we want to use another components template. So we need to provide some kind of setup because else we're going to get an error. So my organization, hello component, is not part of the same template context. So to solve it, if we said that the hello component was also a standalone component, we can import it directly like this, and then the situation would look like this. It's very similar to what we had previously, but now we only have a components, we do not have modules anymore, and those components then define those template contexts for themselves. So that means if the app component tries to use the hello component in its template, and it also imports that hello standalone component, those two template contexts are connected, and therefore this is going to work. So what if we added something more? Let's add the ngIf again. And again, this is going to fail, and the error will give us a hint of the two possible solutions, because it mentions two things. And it's that neither the ngIf directive itself, as a standalone directive, nor the common module was imported. So that means, this gives us this hint that these things should work seamlessly together, and it should be possible to mix and match them with ease. So let's see it in action. So the first option would be to just import the common module, and we know that the common module exports the ngIf directive. It's part of the same template context. So the standalone component is consuming the ngModule. Everything works just fine. Another option would be to add the ngIf as a standalone directive. So then in that case, standalone component uses standalone directive. We will see how the naming will turn out over the years. Maybe it will be just the directive in the end. Now it's a new thing, so we call it like a standalone directive. Great. So basically, I hope you could see that the ngModules and standalone components or standalone APIs are basically two ways of achieving exactly the same goal, which is that we have to provide Angular with the information of what we are using in the template. So Angular currently cannot figure it out by itself. We actually have to tell Angular, in this template we are going to use this, and in that template we are going to use that. So it's still our job to do that, which may change in the future. So, and therefore, it's like the job is the same goal, and that the goal is to define and manage the template context. And therefore, the template context mental model is a great tool to understand this common underlying reality of Angular, that we have to tell compiler what is used in the template, and we have to manage it. Great, so if they are solving the same problem, like what are the differences? Why do we have two ways of doing that? So let's have a look a little bit into that. So first of all, every standalone component must fully define its own template context locally, right? So with the module, one module can have multiple components attached to it in the declarations, so it can define the context for multiple components. With the standalone, every single component has to do it for itself. So it has to specify all the other modules and all the other standalone components which are going to be used in the template. Now, another big difference is that because when we declare the component as a standalone, we cannot specify exports. The standalone components do not support this transitive approach to building of template context. So again, it's much more explicit compared to what we could do with the module, which can be a really good thing. So if we put these things next to each other, then ngModules, it defines the template context often for multiple components. So if you imagine you have a lazy loaded dashboard feature, and there is like a dashboard container which has a list of the widgets, which has the list of widget items, which has different types, and then there is an editor and sorting and tags. Those are many different components which are only used for the dashboard feature, and with the modules we could just specify one template context for all these 12 components in one place, right? So that would be like the ngModule way. So you could say it's less work because it's only management of the single list of imports for that whole feature in that specific example. But that also means that at the same time, it will be much harder to extract one of those 12 components and make it reusable, because we would have to untangle that context later to realize what is only being used in that component. And we can say like that's like this approach provides like a default current compilation speed. Now, if we compare this with the standalone approach, we have to, when we use standalone components, we have to define that template context for every single component by itself. So again, if we had that lazy loaded dashboard feature with 12 components, instead of one list, we would have to manage 12 lists of those imports. So you can say it's more work to maintain that per component. But on the other hand, what we are gaining is a much easier ability to turn one of those components into a reusable shared component or even extract it into a library, because it already knows everything it uses, so we can just basically take it and move it somewhere else. So that's kind of the trade-off. And maybe in the future, it will lead to a possibility to dramatically increase the speed of the compilation, so the rebuild process. So Angular team is exploring that, like using other toolings, and if every file would contain all the information to perform its own compilation, like a component would have its own context, this might enable much faster compilation in the future. So with all these things being said, if you have a lot of time on your hands nowadays, then I would recommend to fully migrate your application to standalone. If you have to prioritize features for the users and like there are some business pressures, you can still get a lot of value from migrating shared components within the application or shared components within your libraries into standalone, but maybe you do not get so much benefit already today migrating your lazy loaded business features to standalone. So that's something which you can then make an informed decision based on this, what are your goals and what is your current situation. So then you can say Angular standalone, as a summary, Angular standalone components are a more explicit way to define template context for the components. So what about the future? If we go back to that presentation I mentioned initially by Pavel Kozlowski from the last year's ngConf, here there is a slide where they show that basically what they realize is that if you have a standalone component which manages its own template context in that imports list, this is basically a duplication of the top of the file where we import those components in the file itself. So maybe in the future, so the Angular team always uses like this snowman placeholder when they don't know what kind of syntax it will be in the future, but what maybe will happen in the future is that we will not need to manage that list of imports anymore, and that the file itself will become the template context. So then we would have three things, right? Module can manage the list of imports, the standalone component can manage the list of imports, or the file would be enough to manage the list of imports of what is used in the template. But now, because we learn about the template context, you can already use that mental model to understand all those three approaches, even the one which may or may not come in the future. So then it maybe will look something like this, right? So if we import something in a file and we just use it in a template, it will just work. We would not need the setup anymore. So that would be the big difference. And then there would be definitely no downside to using of the standalone components. We would not need to manage those list of imports anymore, because it will be most likely taken care of by our like editors, right? So, but we will see. Hopefully this comes soon. Great. So the journey continues. There are really exciting times for Angular nowadays with all those cool things like standalone, APIs, signals. We will see where this road leads, but definitely it's very exciting, and it feels really like a new Angular renaissance. lessons, Angular seems to be very cool again, which makes me really, really happy. So if you enjoy this, like, we have this new Angular blog at angularexperts.io/blog, and especially if you enjoy this topic, there is a much longer, more in-depth version of that. With this blog post, you can recognize it by the picture, so I highly recommend you to go to that blog, subscribe, and you will get notified on your email whenever we publish new article. And that's it. Thank you for your attention. Hope you enjoy the topic. And let's chat after and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Thank you, Thomas, for the amazing session.